This video is a continuation of the Modeling 101 series, and in this video we're going to model this ball bearing. So the first thing I'm going to do is open the sample start scene, and you can grab that from the first video in this series. And then I'm going to load the reference image so I can use it directly in Maya. Remember to do that in your orthographic views, not in your perspective view. So come to the front view, import that image, and then I'm going to move that back out of the way so it doesn't interfere with modeling. And I'm going to set it to looking through camera so it's only available in the view I brought it into. I'm going to maximize my front view by pressing the space bar, and then I'm going to zoom in here. Okay, first step is picking the right primitive. In this case, you could start from a cylinder or you could start from a pipe. Because this has a center hole, the pipe just saves you a step, might as well use it. So double click on that to pull up the options. And then I'm going to reset these so you can see me do the whole process. So I'm looking at the front Z right here. That means I'm down the Z axis. So I want to align this object to Z as well. And then I want to set the number of divisions around it to something that will be smooth. So 36 is going to be fine. If I want it to be smoother, I could push that up higher yet. It just depends how close you're going to get to that object. So something like that's going to be fine, and just click Create. Go to the channel box, grab Polypipe, grab the radius, so I'm selecting the word radius, and then middle click and drag to use virtual sliders. You can add control to get more accuracy in that. You can see we're not quite centered, so I'll deal with that in a minute. I'm going to grab thickness, control middle click and drag to get that lined up as well. So I'll just say something like that's pretty close for now. And I'll press 4 for wireframe. And then I'm going to move the image instead of moving the object. You want to leave your object at the origin. There are a lot of advantages in modeling to leaving your object at the origin. So when you can, just move your image or your reference so that it lines up. All right, so I'll move this now where I look at the gap on top and bottom here. Try to get that centered. Something like that looks pretty good. And then the gap on left and right to make that look good. And then we're pretty close. So I'll go ahead and grab the pipe again and grab that radius and drive that up. And my stopping point is the outer one here. So something like that looks good. And then on the inner one, my stopping point is actually this dark area here. This line that you see around the bottom, this is actually the thickness of the body of the bearing. So I actually want to stop here because that's the true thickness of the element. The rest of that is perspective distortion. So I'll add thickness onto that and stop there, and that looks pretty good. Looks like I'm still not perfectly centered, but this is good enough for driving this thing home. All right, so now I want to go ahead and add some bevels. You can see the bevels on the outside and the inside. It looks like the inside has a slightly different bevel. This one looks like it might be a little bit more rounded. So I'm going to do these as separate bevel operations. I'll just tap the space bar and I'll just make my selection here in the perspective. I'm going to go ahead and add the bevel to both the inside and the outside of this thing. All right, so I'll tap the space bar to go back into the front view. So the modeling toolkit, this is where all of your tools are, and I'll just tap bevel. I'm going to grab fraction on this one and left click, drag down, or to the left to go down. So in that case, I actually held control as well to have a little more accuracy. So that looks pretty good. You can see it's a little off on the top and bottom, but here through the sides where it's sort of an average of being foreshortened and being a little longer than it should, maybe this is pretty close, so I'll just go with that. On the outside of this body, I'll just tap the space bar again. I'm going to grab both of those loops and run a separate bevel out here. So I'll just run bevel there. Again, I'm going to double check what I have going on in here. And I'm going to decrease that fraction, something like this, but this feels rounded. So I'm going to add more segments onto that. So just until it smooths out. So that looks pretty good, something like that. Okay, I'm going to turn off the grid here just to get that out of the way. Okay, so that gets the basic shape in, and now we need to worry about adding additional geometry so that we can add this channel here. And the way to do that is going to be the multi-cut tool. So with the object selected, click multi-cut, and then move your cursor over the object and then just hold the control key. And as soon as you do, you'll see that you'll be able to insert edge loops onto this thing. So I'll just put the cursor where I want the edge loop and click, and then I'll pull out to where I want this one to be and then click there as well. Okay, so You can actually see it is off by a fair amount out here. You just got to pick one and stay consistent. Like, don't sometimes make it based on this side, and then other times over here. Just stay consistent, and then we'll see what comes out of it. So something like this looks basically fine. And so now what I need to do is actually add the depth into this, so this thing actually recedes down and into the shape. Okay, so I'm going to tap the space bar. This is something you cannot do in the front view because it's going into depth. So I'm going to tap Q so I can get back to my select tool, and I'm going to select one face and then shift double click its neighbor in order to select all the faces in that ring. All right, and then I'm going to press extrude, and I'm just going to push that back until it's as thick as it needs to be. All right, if you push too far, things will turn black on you, and that's you've actually pushed through the back side of the object. So in this case, I want to be somewhere around there. That's looking pretty good. All right, so this thing actually does push in along this edge as well. So I'm going to select one face and then shift double click another face right there. That looks pretty good. And I actually don't want this to go all the way to the top. I don't want this to be super thin right here. So before I do this extrusion, I'm going to add another little lip right here. So I'm going to go to the, I could bevel that would be fine, but in this case, multi-cut's going to work well. So whatever thickness I think that should have, something like that looks good to me. I'll add that. Then I'll make that face selection. So select one and shift double click again, and that gives me that whole span. Now I'm going to click extrude. I'm going to add some thickness onto that where it goes in. And again, don't go so far that it pokes out the inside. Just something like that is going to look good right there. All right. And if you want it to have a little taper, you can also add a little offset to that. So something like that would not be a bad idea in this case. So that's just something that's going to hug the spheres as they fit into this object. All right, so something like that is looking good. I'm going to go ahead and right click and choose assign an existing material. I'm going to assign that dull silver to this. This just allows us to see what things are looking like. And it's generally looking pretty good. I'll just maximize that. Generally looking pretty good. Still got some really sharp edges here. These haven't been beveled at all. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of beveling those out now. So I'll just make my selections from here just as easy. So I'll go to edge mode, double click, shift double click, and shift double click all of these edges that I want to get a bevel. All right, so this is going to be a very small radius bevel just to catch the light. That looks pretty good. Actually, I think this one should not be selected. Let me double check that. Yeah, this has a much broader bevel, so I'll do that one later. I'll just deselect that guy, and then run bevel on that. And so this bevel, the whole point of this bevel is just having a small area that's going to catch the light for us. So we want that to be a very small offset, and we want it to be all softened edges. So these where they're still hardened, well, we need to come back and soften out those edges a little bit. And it might be advantageous just to add one more segment on those just to help smooth them out just a little bit more. All right, so with just that change, you'll see the difference here now as I move around this. You see how it catches the light now on that edge instead of being a really sharp and ugly sort of CG style. Now you catch that light. That's what really makes things pop. Bevels everywhere. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and get this bevel in place. So again, I'll do this from the front view. Double check over here what that size actually looks like. I'm going to run a bevel on it, reduce that fraction back. Again, I'll just kind of try to average this. It doesn't even look the same at all over here. It's a little bit confusing to look at. I'm just going to try to average it and say that's somewhere about in the range that I wanted it to be. I'll come back out here and take a look at beveling both of those. So I just want to, again, just add another tiny bevel onto those, very small fraction. I don't want it to be a huge offset like that. Just a little bit of something, and then a third segment's good. Okay, and I'll just maximize this view just so I can see what we have going on. All right, so that's holding up well now. That's catching light the way I want. All my edges look nice and clean. It does look like there's a little bit of a break here. So because I set up my preferences so I can see soft and hardened edges, it jumps out at you. And here you can see that break. See how this is this clear break in the form? In order to get rid of that, because I want this whole thing to be softened right now, I'll just do mesh display and soften edge with the whole object selected, and that will smooth that whole thing out. So you can see that that just cleans that whole thing up. So that's it. That's pretty much it for what we needed to do on that bit. I'll tap the space bar and go back in here to the front view. Okay, so just for the sake of time, I'm going to be quick about this, and we're just going to add the spheres. We're not going to add these little in-between bits. So I'm going to go ahead and add a sphere. And it's a good idea to check your options on that. Make sure you're not way too much resolution. In this case, it came in something reasonable. These are going to be pretty small spheres, so they don't need to be super high res. So I'll just kind of move this into place. I'll just take a look to make sure that it looks like I basically have the right size here. That's pretty close to what it should be. Let's just say something like that. And I'll double check what that looks like out here in my perspective view. Okay, so I made that channel a little deeper than it needed to be. It's not a big deal. Going to work totally fine in this case. So I'll select the sphere, right click, add or assign an existing, and I'm going to go ahead and assign that shiny silver because those are shiny spheres in this thing. Okay, and I'm just going to bounce back to the front view here. Again, that's just spacebar in and out. And basically what I want to do is radially distribute these spheres to make this, to finish this thing off. And so I need to know the number of spheres that I have. In this case, there are 14 spheres. And so the way I figure out how far they need to move is I have to calculate 360, the total number of degrees around this thing, divided by the number that we have. So 360 divided by 14 is going to give us the number that we need. But as of right now, if I duplicate these, they're just going to duplicate in place. So you can see that as I rotate this, it just rotates in place. What I want to be able to do is rotate this around the origin. And that's why we left this object at the origin, to make this kind of thing really easy. So I can either move the pivot point for the object to the origin by using the pivot point move mode, or I can simply do edit group and make sure that the group pivot is set to the origin. As soon as I do that, you'll see the the pivot will jump to the origin, and now as I rotate it, you see that it rotates around and it stays exactly in that channel. So the advantage of doing a group like this instead of just moving the pivot point for an individual object is I could first of all do this with multiple objects selected, and they could all use one common pivot. And another advantage is I still have my local axis to rotate this thing on. So if I needed to do something on the local axis, I can still do that. So if you select the sphere and you're trying to get the group, you can always press the up arrow, and that does pick walk up. You can also grab it over here in the outliner. If you don't see the outliner, that's just Windows outliner. All right, so let's go ahead and do the math on this. So I'll pop up the calculator here, and I'll put in 360 divided by 14, the total number that we have, and that gives us 25.714. That is the number of iterations, degrees that we need to go around per iteration. So I'll pop up duplicate special and reset those settings. And then in here, what I want to do is look at the axis. So I'm on front Z. So this is X, Y, Z. So on the Z axis, I want to put 25.714. And then the total number of copies need to be 14, but we already have one that we're starting from, so we need 13 new ones. And just click duplicate special. So that should give us the basic look of the ball bearing. It looks like it's basically correct. I'll just tap to come out of there and go to the perspective view. And now here's what we have for the ball bearing. Okay, so you could always go back in and add those little dividers, but that is the basic idea of how to do this. So as far as finishing this thing off, I might call this bearing. And it has a bit of history on it. It's a good idea to get in the habit of removing history where you don't need it. And after you do component level tweaks, you're basically out of luck on history anyways. And if you're done with an object, it looks the way that you want. It's typically good practice to get rid of history just so that it's not so cumbersome and error prone. So I'll do edit, delete all by type history, and that deletes all the history in the entire scene, which is what I want in this case. And then I'm going to grab all of the spheres. So I'm just going to hold shift and marquee select this. I don't care the order of selection in this case. And I'll just call this ball. and then they'll all get renamed. And then with all of those selected, I'm going to shift select the outer shell, sort of the casing. I'm going to choose edit and then parent. And that's just the P key. And now whenever I grab the bearing, it automatically is going to move all of the spheres around with it. All right, so all these just end up being empty groups. They're not needed anymore, so I can just delete those. And now I just have this one object called bearing that has all of the balls underneath it as children. All right, so that should do it on the ball bearing.